Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's webinar from HR Solutions. The topic of interest today is about personal relationships and the implications of when these relations overspill into the workplace. Let's do some introductions first. Some of you may know us already, of course, but we have Victoria Templeton, who's our HR Knowledge Manager and who's going to be the main presenter today. There's myself, the Operations Manager, and we've also got a team who's there in the background helping with any technical queries that you have during the webinar and helping to collate all the questions. We're going to begin today's webinar by putting context around our topic today and defining what we mean by personal relationships at work and exploring both the benefits and challenges that come with them. As with anything people related, there's a legal framework which needs to be considered, and so in this webinar we will talk through how this underpins the topic. We will then look at the practical measures organisations can adopt to ensure personal relationships and risks are effectively managed. Before we then look at having a policy to communicate your organisation's position on personal relationships at work. So before we do that, as with all our webinars, there will be opportunity for questions at the end. We do want to hear your questions, but please note that there are a lot of people on the call today, so for obvious reasons you are all on mute. As we said, we will answer your questions at the end of the webinar and encourage you to ask them via the chat panel as you go, so that we can then be ready to arrange for these to be asked. Here's a quick guide to show you how to do that. You should have a GoToWebinar panel that looks something like this. Please type your question in the questions pane and we will aim to read out and answer as many as we can at the end. We also want to make this session as interactive as we would normally at our physical events, so we will be running a series of polls throughout the session as well. When we have a poll, it will appear on your screen and you just select the answer that is appropriate for you. And that's the housekeeping out the way. We'll progress with the webinar. And we'll begin the webinar by putting the context around our topic. So I'll hand over to Victoria, who's going to take you through.
Thank you, Sue. Hopefully everybody can see my screen now. Thank you. And good afternoon, everybody. And welcome to today's webinar. So we're going to begin today's webinar putting the context around our topic today and defining what we mean by personal relationships at work and exploring how they can both benefit an organisation but also bring challenges. So how do we define personal relationships? Well, these include family relationships, sexual relationships, very close friendships, but also one that perhaps may not be thought of is a personal relationship that relates to close business, commercial and financial relationships. There are many benefits of personal relationships at work, and they can really bring value and benefit to an organisation. They can bring greater commitment towards a business due to increased personal interest. They can encourage wider business knowledge as people involved discuss their roles and daily issues. They can ease the recruitment search and actually reduce recruitment costs by introducing a partner or family member to the organisation, subject to normal fair selection processes, of course. And any staff referral that you may get from an existing staff member will be for people who are of like-minded and more likely to fit your culture quickly. And they can help the organisation to become a visible local employer of choice by recruiting people from the same locality. However, not all personal relationships in the workplace are positive, and so we're going to now look at some of the issues that can come about because of a personal relationship at work. So there can be conflict of interests. So a conflict of interest is when an employee's personal relationship is with another close business or commercial interest, which then conflicts with the professional interests that they owe to their employer. Most common examples of this are those employees who have their own business or hold second jobs with other employers. They could give rise to subjective and unfair recruitment decisions if steps are not taken to manage close relationships properly. And you could also run the risk of preferential treatment of employees. So if two employees who have a close personal relationship are in the same team or department. And confidentiality breaches could also occur if personal relationships are not managed appropriately and could lead to an abuse of an employee's position of trust and confidentiality. You may start seeing underperformance. So where an employee who was once somebody that performed to deadlines, targets and other KPIs, but aren't now, then it could be because of that personal relationship starting to overspill into the workplace. They may become more distracted, for instance. You may also see inappropriate behaviours, as unfortunately there are occasions where personal relationships turn sour, and the impact of this can cross over into the workplace. Inappropriate behaviours may be displayed by either one or both parties. And of course, some of these very serious behaviours could include claims of bullying and harassment by one of the parties. So as a consequence, the organisation may find itself having to address behavioural issues through responding to grievances. And furthermore, grievances could be raised where one party feels dissatisfied with the way in which the organisation is treating that personal relationship and perceive it as being unfair. So I'm going to hand over to Sue because I think we're going to do a poll now for everybody.
Yes, we've got a couple of polls here for you. So the first one we'd like to ask is, would you say personal relationships at work have been beneficial or problematic to the organisation? So I'm just going to launch that poll first for you. And there's the question on the screen for you. We'll just give chance for the majority of you to vote. Okay, I'll close that poll now. So as you can see, we've got a significant majority of you that have had some challenges, either positively or negatively, from personal relationships in the organisation. And there's a number of you also have not experienced any issues, so it's good for you to be prepared and have things in place in advance rather than have to react should you have a problem in the future. So we've got another question for you. So this one is, how many of you feel that it is your place to intervene in personal relationships at work? So I'm just selecting that poll for you now. Sorry, my poll button is stuck. There we go. So how many of you feel that it is your place to intervene in personal relationships at work? Okay, a couple more seconds. There's a few more voting now. Okay, let's close that poll. So interestingly, this one was moving almost 50-50 all the way through that as people were voting. So it's quite divided actually, whether it is our place to intervene in relationships at work. So I think that should be interesting for you to follow up on, Victoria.
Yes,
I'll
thank you, Sue.
just close this off.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay,
Back
thank
to
you. Thanks, Sue. So, whilst in most cases personal relationships can work fine in the workplace, there are occasions when problems do occur. And as with anything relating to your people at work, there are legal considerations to be aware of. So we're now going to just spend some time understanding what that legal framework is. So there are a number of pieces of employment legislation that should guide us in how we manage personal relationships that cross over into the workplace. So first of all, Article 8 of the Human Rights Act of 1988 gives employees the right to respect for private and family life, meaning that employees have the right to a degree of privacy at work. So to place a total ban on personal relationships at work is unrealistic and too much of an interference with an employee's right to a private life. So it should be encouraged that personal relationships at work are seen as normal and in fact can bring a lot of positive benefits. However, whilst employers have no right to interfere with their employees' personal relationships, they do actually have a right to act when a relationship at work has a detrimental effect on the business. So for addressing any issues, be sure that you have justification to do so, in that you can reasonably show that as a consequence of that relationship, it is having a detrimental impact on your business. You then have the Equality Act of 2010, and under which employees are protected from being unfairly treated and discriminated against for holding a protected characteristic. So a protected characteristic includes sex, sexual orientation, marriage or civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, age, disability, and gender reassignment. Under the Equality Act, there are 4 types of discrimination. You have direct, indirect, harassment, and victimisation. So direct discrimination is where an employee is treated differently or worse than someone else, and that reason for the different treatment is connected to a protected characteristic. So a couple of simple examples of where sex discrimination can occur in respect of personal relationships could, for example, be where, say, a female employee, not the male, is being asked to leave by the business, and that, because of the personal relationship, the female could be arguing that she, why is she being asked to leave, but is she being chosen over a male colleague as a direct result of her sex? Or another example of when you're recruiting, you choose not to offer a job to an applicant because of who they're married to, and they're married to somebody that already works in the business, and you might actually feel it'd be too difficult to manage. You're actually making a decision then on the basis of their marital status. You then have harassment under the Equality Act, and that harassment is subjecting somebody to unwanted conduct, which is related to a protected characteristic, where the conduct has the purpose of violating the victim's dignity or creating an environment that's intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive. In order to bring a claim for harassment at an employment tribunal, the treatment must be connected to one of those protected characteristics I mentioned a moment ago. So an example here could be where a personal relationship is broken down. One party then subjects the other to unwanted personal contact in the workplace. So it may be a series of intimidating emails and humiliating comments, making that person feel that they're being harassed. A sex discrimination claim could then be lodged for harassment, and it would be done so under the grounds of sex discrimination. We also then have the Employment Rights Act, which gives protection to employees from both constructive and unfair dismissals. So constructive dismissal is where there has been a fundamental breach of contract by the employer, i.e. there's been an act that goes to the root of the contract which is sufficiently serious to justify the employee resigning. Instances of harassment or discrimination may therefore entitle employees to resign and claim constructive dismissal. The resignation must be in connection with the act, and there must not be too long a delay in resigning in response. And as an employer, your responsibility is to ensure that the working environment is safe and without risks to health, including being free of discrimination and harassment. An obligation for employees, therefore, is to deal promptly, fairly, and impartially with any complaint of bullying and harassment. Unfair dismissal is when an employee is entitled to claim their dismissal was unfair by either the way in which the process was managed or the reason for the decision was unfair. So, for instance, say the sanction was not proportionate to the issue, or the reason for the dismissal was not one of the recognised fair reasons by law. So to illustrate this, one example we have is where perhaps a serious breach of confidentiality has occurred by an employee, and they've breached it to a friend who works elsewhere in the business. And they've breached that confidentiality with disclosing highly sensitive commercial information. That's likely to amount to a gross misconduct. Therefore, to dismiss for a first offence could be a fair reason to dismiss, so long as a fair process has been conducted, of course. The sanction of dismissal in this situation is therefore likely to be proportionate to the incident and so seen as a fair response. Versus another example where perhaps, say, an organisation's summarily dismissed an employee for gross misconduct because of a new relationship that has been formed with a colleague. It's causing them to perhaps miss their normal KPIs, deadlines, and perhaps has led to some general poor timekeeping and attendance. And you're actually seeing some distraction from their ability to do the job. So to dismiss for a first offence of this would be an unfair dismissal, because it's likely to be seen as a drastic response to what is actually relatively a minor offence, and so not proportionate. And then as a final flag, although not a piece of employment legislation, we still do have the Protection of Harassment Act of 1997. And this is separate to the Equality Act 2010, and an employee could actually make a claim through the civil courts rather than the tribunal courts in accordance with this piece of criminal legislation. And so I just wanted to sort of flag that whilst we're talking about the legal considerations here. So to mitigate against risk, we'll now take a look at some of the practical measures organisations can adopt to ensure personal relationships are effectively supported but managed as well. So I made reference earlier to there being some measures that we could put in place as part of managing workplace relationships. One of the things you can do is actually introduce an employee declaration form. So where you ask job applicants to declare any personal relationships. This is actually about enabling the organisation to then take reasonable and appropriate steps on appointment to safeguard the business. However, it must never be used as a bar to employment. An employee who may be involved in a recruitment process who has a personal relationship with a candidate perhaps should not then be involved in that selection process. By removing them from it, it removes any potential challenge that the process was unfair. For existing staff, we'd perhaps suggest a process where people actually report new personal relationships, where you're notified, and then what you would do is sit down and review whether any risks exist from that. And then that gives you time to actually then look at what reasonable steps to put in place to manage. And where a personal relationship exists between a line manager and an employee, then actually consider having the employee report to an alternative line manager. But of course, it may not be practicable for the employee to report to somebody else, such as the type of role they do or the size of the department just can't accommodate it. So a reasonable alternative would be to look at the amending certain working practices that you have to enable you to remove any potential bias. So, for example, you may bring in an additional level of authorization to some of your key processes, such as your expense process or your annual leave booking process. You may actually also want to remove the line manager for being involved in any of your other formal processes you have in place as an organisation, such as grievance cases and handling disciplinary processes. Now, you could consider an alternative role as a way of managing the risk. So if you are unable to change the reporting line or manage the risk sufficiently through adjusting working practices, then a last consideration could be to explore transferring one party to an alternative role. Now, this, however, does come with caution. If not managed appropriately, or if there were other measures available that would prevent a role change, but you are ignoring them, then you risk constructive dismissal claims, or even depending on circumstances, you could risk a discrimination claim. So it does come with caution. It would certainly need to be your last area of consideration, and the courts would expect you to be able to show how all other steps would not work or would be a detriment to the business. And that also that you've acted reasonably and fairly in trying to manage that transition. But so long as you can overcome these, then in theory, this could be an option. And as I say, I would suggest it's pretty much a last option to consider. So if you genuinely believe a change of working line or adjusting working practices could not remove the risk, then enter discussions with both parties on a way forward, part of which would be to explore transferring roles. You're effectively consulting, and so you want to ensure that you're keeping records of your discussions and also document in writing to your employee. The transfer would need to be done sensitively and carefully so you don't discriminate on the grounds of gender or any of the other protected characteristics, and must be done in a way that you don't force one party into a position either unfairly or unreasonably. And you're ultimately, through this process, looking to seek the agreement and consent. Where you are successful in seeking that consent, then you'd just give notice as per their contract for them to transfer into a new role. But where you don't get the consent, this is actually a warning sign, because if you continue with the move and the employee continues to be in disagreement with you, then you're likely to be facing perhaps some grievances, or worse still, a resignation and perhaps a subsequent claim then for your constructive dismissal for a fundamental breach of trust and confidence. So it does obviously, as I say, come with caution, but it is potentially something that could be explored. What we would always say is that if you're ever in that kind of situation, then always seek HR advice on how to address it and deal with it. And I would say 9 times out of 10, you are perhaps able to do other things like change line manager or just adapt your working processes. So another measure available to deal with risk is the disciplinary framework. So disciplinary process is about changing behaviour rather than acting as a punishment. So if you are seeing issues coming about from a personal relationship at work, maybe the wrong behaviours or reasonable instructions that are being given aren't being abided by, then you have a formal framework in which you can address it and to stop that behaviour from continuing. Being mindful of the relevant legislation that I've just spoke about, it may be appropriate to use a company's disciplinary process as a measure to address the risk. So remember, Article 8 of the Human Rights Act gives employees the right to respect for private and family life, meaning the employee has the right to a degree of privacy in the workplace. So do employers have the right to act when a personal relationship at work impacts business? Well, the answer is yes. When that relationship crosses over into work and begins to have a detrimental effect on the business, then you can take action. It may be you see the work performance deteriorate. It might be the management of that individual starts becoming difficult, or in fact you may even see cases of harassment, or even the business with clients is jeopardised by rival business interests. Just be sure you can demonstrate that the personal relationship is having a detrimental impact on the organisation, as that will be the basis for any disciplinary process and subsequent action that you take. So bearing in mind the legal framework, there must be a fair and reasonable process. That's part of avoiding any risk from an unfair dismissal or any constructive dismissal claims. So to ensure a fair and reasonable process, you'll need to make sure that you're following not only your own disciplinary policy, but any personal relationship at work policy that you have in place. And also all your disciplinary procedures should be in line with the ACAS Code of Practice on managing disciplinary. Be sure that you can evidence the detrimental impact the relationship has had on the business. Focus on the impact the relationship is having, not the people involved. And deal fairly and consistently with all those involved. If taking disciplinary action, then be sure that a genuine and reasonable belief has been formed that the business has suffered a detriment on the basis of the evidence that is in front of you in that disciplinary hearing. And as I've said previously, the sanction must be proportionate to the incident. I'm just going to hand over to Sue because I think we've got another quick poll coming up.
We have. So before we move on to the next section, we thought we'd ask how many of you have a policy specifically dedicated to close relationships in the workplace? So I'm just going to launch that poll. I think nearly all of you have voted. Give it a couple more minutes. Okay, I'll close that poll now for you and share the results. So a significant number of you don't have a policy specifically dedicated to close relationships in the workplace. So an interesting statistic for you, Victoria, to take forward.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that is interesting because we're going to come on now to talking about policy. Why do we have one, and what can we expect to see within it? So whilst 99% of the time personal relationships can be beneficial, as you know, for an organisation, and doesn't always lead to conflict or impact the business negatively. But there are unfortunately times when relationships do break down and we see the negative impact of that at work. Having a policy will actually help you to ensure you manage the relationships and do so fairly. So it's striking that balance, isn't it? So people have the right to a private life versus actually a business needs to take act when something happens and crosses over into the workplace that starts causing a detriment. HR policy should always be seen as positively as it sets out clear boundaries. It sets the scene, it tells people what's expected and what's not, and what may happen if standards are breached. Policy helps drive the culture of an organisation. If workplace relationships are to be embraced, then let your employees know. And having a policy is actually also good for line managers, especially those who may be new to line management. It can act as a comfort blanket, reassuring them that decisions they're making are okay, and actually they're in line with how the organisation wants them to operate it. But for those occasions where workplace relationships break down, it can give structure, clarity and guidance on how to manage and deal with the situation, not only fairly but consistently, which is obviously very important. So what sort of things should we include? Well, as with any policy, setting out its purpose and scope is vital to ensuring that you gain buy-in to the rules that are set out within it. Knowing why you are introducing measures in managing personal relationships will also support and underpin any action the organisation may need to take for any breach. So the areas we would suggest would include definitions of what constitutes a personal relationship, what happens if there is a breach of the policy, how to deal with unwanted personal contact after a relationship has ended, and how to manage personal relationships in the workplace, such as managing those behaviours, recruiting, management issues and conflict of interest. But also importantly, linked to other relevant policies, such as the disciplinary policy, the grievance policy, and if you have a bullying and harassment policy, to that one too. And importantly, it's putting the consequence of what happens if that policy is breached. So from an employment tribunal perspective, a court will want to be satisfied that there are written rules that tells the employee what is acceptable and that the employee was clear on the consequences if breached. And that also those rules have been sufficiently communicated across the business and implemented consistently by all. So I think hopefully we'll have had some questions come in on today's webinar. So I'm just going to ask Sue to submit some questions if she's had some through.
Okay, yes, we've got one or two questions for you here, if you're ready for them.
Yeah.
The first one is, we believe 2 of our employees are in fact in a relationship, but neither have confirmed it. Is there any risk for us, and what can we do?
Okay, so let's remember under the Human Rights Act, employees do have the right to respect privacy and family life. So they have a degree of privacy. I can't tell from the question whether the relationship's starting to cause any problems for the organisation. So let's assume there's no problems. Then in this case, it's very difficult for the business to do anything if either party haven't notified of any relationship. And of course, there's no obvious detrimental impact on the business. On the other hand, if you were to have a situation where perhaps that relationship has been declared and you're now starting to see a decline, a detrimental impact on the business, decline in work, and perhaps you could sometimes be in receipt of feedback from colleagues around the amount of contact that's been observed between 2 others, then you could have good reason to raise the issue of concern around that performance and explore it with those that it's affected by it. If you have consistent feedback from multiple sources reporting things to you, then you could raise the feedback, but the employee you're raising it with may not acknowledge the relationship or declare it at that point. But the fact that you've broached the subject with them might make them more mindful of the situation moving forward, and so you might start seeing some slight improvements just for the simple fact you've had the quiet word. In regards to feedback, if you've only received feedback from one colleague in the team complaining or observing somebody's being distracted, then be careful, because you don't want, you may want to try and observe it for yourself first, so that you can then go into that conversation giving the feedback from your own, what you have witnessed yourself, and you're putting it from your own perspective. What you don't want is to end up in a situation where a person's accusing the other party of making things up. So when you do get feedback from people in the team, then just be mindful of how to move forward with it, depending on the amount of feedback you've had and how you then take next steps.
Okay, thank you. So another question is, several employees have second jobs, so therefore what should they be doing to protect them business?
Okay, so I guess a good starting place moving forward, first of all, is to actually put in contracts a requirement that secondary employment must not compete with your business and must be declared. So not only will this enable you to manage the potential risk, but also from a working time regulations perspective, you can actually, you need to manage the health and safety of your staff and be aware of the number of weekly hours they're working. But in terms of developing a mechanism for existing staff to report second employment is also going to be important for these same reasons. So if you don't have anything in place now, then it perhaps would be good looking at how you can introduce something, because as I say, the working time regulations, people have to obviously be restricted with how many hours they work each week. If you're the main employer, then you've got a duty of care towards that. But also you need to be aware of any potential conflict so that you can perhaps take any necessary steps and put in place any measures you may need to.
Thank you. And one more question that we've had is it easier to have a blanket policy of not allowing personal relationships at work? That's an interesting one.
It is, and it is hard, and I think whilst a blanket approach, whilst it's not discriminatory, because you're not discriminating against a particular individual, I guess the danger that you would have with it is that perhaps is it too unrealistic. So in principle you could have it, but the thing is, what you might think is around whether it would have any impact on your recruitment, perhaps how it what your labour market is like in your local area. Could that blanket approach perhaps risk or restrict your access to potential good applicants? And like I said in a moment ago, it's actually, we should embrace it. It should be seen as the normal. So perhaps it might be something that you don't want to restrict potential applicants and employees to your workplace. The other thing I'd probably say is that if you're drawing the line at partners, how would that seem fair if you could, in theory, then employ friends or other relations? Again, whilst it's not discriminatory, it could affect employee engagement or your reputation in the local market. So, you know, personally, I think it's about embracing it and remember those benefits that we went through earlier at the start of the webinar. You know, there could be a lot of great benefits that it brings to an organisation.
Thank you. We have had another question that we did broach on during the webinar, and it is where somebody's got a senior person who's in a relationship with a staff member who reports to him, and would it be reasonable to have her report to someone else and form a policy that includes this? So I guess that's almost, do you bring the policy in first, or do you move the person, or
Yeah.
one get on the other?
Okay. So I guess if we think about the context in which we need to deal with people's situations like this, you know, the legal framework, then I think the first thing is human rights and the right to privacy. But then from an employer perspective, it's also identifying any potential risk that may come about inadvertently through that relationship. So it's not about denying the relationship or, you know, not allowing it to happen. It's just about putting protective measures in place. So changing the line manager could well be an appropriate response. Or like I said earlier, around if that's not possible, I mean, I don't know the size of the organisation and the structure of that organisation for the person that raised the question, but you could look at adapting work practices if you're unable to change your reporting line. But I do think certainly it warrants a conversation, an open conversation. Presumably it's not private, it's public knowledge that this perhaps relationship's going on. Sometimes you don't even get that, which can make it hard. But look at how you can look at changing some of the working practices. You know, that they'll have financial responsibilities, won't they? The senior manager, budget control, and sign off to other things, holiday and other forms of leave. So think about those measures, but do it in a positive way. And you know, it's not in any way about not wanting people to have their own right to privacy, but it's just balancing it, isn't it? And yeah, you could, as a side, it could be your opportunity then to sort of roll out a policy company-wide, and try and do that positively so that it's embraced by people. Because quite often it's in organisations, it's a bit of a tricky situation or conversation to be had, isn't it? Because it's very personal, it feels very personal. So, and again, it's not about the people, but it's about the impact, isn't it? So, like in that question that's come through, the impact is around, well, okay, our work processes, that senior manager might sign off their expenses, might sign off holiday, etc.
Yeah, and it's to protect the manager as much as it is the employee, isn't it?
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
And I think if you put out a positive policy, embracing relationships at work, you are more likely to have people come forward and approach you about relationships, so you can help them be able to continue the relationship and also successfully continue in their role. You can have a supportive move forward, can't you? In helping them with managing it.
Yeah, I think if you are going to look to introduce a policy, definitely having a positive spin on it, as opposed to it coming across as if we're trying to hamper relationships and restrict them. And you know, remember some of the benefits that we talked about at the start. So you know, we want to encourage staff referrals. You know, we see that people have family members who don't work for us at the moment, but it'd be great for them to come and join us. You know, recruitment costs, we can look at saving money, you know, just by finding out, you know, who in our own network out of work might actually be great for working for us. So put it as a positive spin, and then when you come to launch a policy, clearly there'll be some comments and paragraphs in there that talk about what to do if things are, you know, the policy's breached or you have to address things. But they're in every policy anyway. but yeah, think about the communication and how you word the launch of any new policy.
And And I think that also answers, we had another question around, would you dismiss someone for having a relationship at work where they have no policy and it would be a first offence? I think it's all around, what is the offence? Having a
It is
relationship is not an offence, is it? It's
absolutely. So if you think about the two examples I gave, so one extreme is that serious breach of confidentiality and sensitive business information that's being disclosed. That is absolutely, without question, a very serious offence which could give rise to that instant dismissal, for gross misconduct effect. Whereas just having the relationship, that's not what the issue is. The conduct is the breaching the confidentiality, or the poor timekeeping for your distractions and coming in late, or so it all very much depends on the circumstances of the case, and what's reasonable. And as we know with employment law, reasonable is not defined, so it can be a little bit tricky, but just seek your HR advice if you are in that situation.
absolutely. And one final question, I think today, if we haven't answered your question, there are one or two more. I've tried to group them where we're covering off several in one go. If the CEO is in a relationship with an employee, is it discriminatory not to allow that employee to apply for roles where they would be directly managed by the CEO? That's an interesting one, isn't it?
Well, it's very interesting. So would it be discriminatory if they weren't allowed to apply for roles that worked for
Managed by the CEO,
managed by the
they're actually putting themselves in the direct line relationship.
So I suppose some thoughts that come to mind is around, we talked about measures, changing work activities, working practices, changing reporting line. People shouldn't be restricted from opportunities to develop their career. I think if you do have a scenario like that, then it's having that practical conversation around what measures could be in place to mitigate risk. So it's not about preventing people from internal development and promotions. I guess it's how that organisation can manage those risks and what steps they can put in place. So it's limited.
To happen, I guess, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, they've come back saying further that she can't actually be promoted because of a relationship, technically. So it is restricting that, but is there anything they can do? I guess is if she can have a dotted reporting line for approval of things, and that it's purely in terms of governing how her work is carried out. So it's purely around the role rather than the more personal related stuff, such as booking holidays and signing up expenses. Could another manager
do that,
be a co-manager for those kind of purposes, and sign them off just to protect the CEO from any claim of unfairness?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's in selection processes for other, if you're selecting a number of staff to represent the company in different things, just making sure the decision isn't made by somebody who has a relationship with one of them and likely to be biased, as you share the decision.
Exactly.
Yeah, and if it's the role responsibilities that are the issue, then I guess that may be involving another manager or HR if you have that role in your organisation, or use an outsourced facility to just talk through, to ensure there's an independent review to try and help you work through any possible solutions. I think it's probably worth going to that extent before actually saying, well, it's difficult to actually promote you, without trying to put something in place.
I suppose the other thing that can probably be quite difficult to manage is perception. So, all these things can be looked at and you can have that constructive, practical conversation, but give thought about perception. So the work colleagues around, on the face of it, they'll see, if they know the relationship's going on and they see that person reporting to the CEO, it's thinking about how you manage that perception to reassure the rest of the workplace that different treatment isn't going on. And it's been about transparent and open, isn't it? But
Yeah.
people shouldn't be restricted from internal promotions and development. It's trying to find a workable solution that protects all parties.
I think getting your S&T on board with any decisions and decisions coming from the S&T, not just from the CEO, the direct line manager, which is probably another way around it. So hopefully that's given you some food for thought. I say if we haven't got to your question, then we will come directly back to you afterwards. But I think we've covered most of the general themes. If any of you are interested in a policy or in any support with any of this, then do get in touch with us and we can see if we can help you. More than happy to help. As always, if you have any feedback, we are gratefully receive any feedback. Either way, we always take anything you raise seriously and try and act on it. We do have a number of webinars coming up. We've just put up our next quarter's webinars and are actually working on a couple more for the end of the year as well, and probably one or two more will be slotted in during the coming weeks. So please do have a look and sign up for them if you're interested. And as always, if you want to keep in touch and be advised of when new webinars are coming up, then sign up for our newsletters. And we'll keep you in touch with any legal updates, especially at the moment with all the consistent changes we're having on furloughs and everything related to it. And for any of our webinars, including this one, which will be posted soon, we have a webinar archive, which you can look at your leisure. So thank you very much for attending. We hope you found it useful, and we look forward to hearing some of you in future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.